This is chapter 31, part 2, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In the last section, we talked about the fall of communism across Eastern Europe, almost like dominoes, starting in Poland and finally taking out Romania at the very end, with Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary in the middle. The last part of the story is communism coming to an end in the Soviet Union itself, which is where it was born and formed, starting in 1917 with the Russian Revolution and Lenin. So the protest movements that started in Eastern Europe eventually spread to the Soviet Union itself, and anti-communist demonstrations became a big thing, beginning in the about January of 1990, just weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Communists began to be defeated in local elections, which amazingly were being held at that time. The first member of the Soviet Union to back out, was the country of Lithuania. And all of these nations were members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So Lithuania is an example of a Soviet Socialist Republic, one of many, including Russia, that formed the Soviet Union for 60, 70 years. Lithuania backed away and withdrew from the Union and said we want it to be an independent nation. And this is a huge test for Gorbachev. What was he going to do? In the past, when countries would try to back out, for example, the Hungarian Revolution of '56, Prague Spring of '68, these were much more minor reform movements than what Lithuania was doing, and they were crushed. But in this case, Gorbachev kept his word and was consistent, and he refused to intervene militarily. At this point, Gorbachev starts to be considered weak by members of his own Communist Party. There starts to be a division among the leaders of the Soviet Union as to the future of Russia. And is Gorbachev's new approach to dealing with foreign affairs the right approach, or should it be should he be replaced with someone more hardline? And then on the other side of the coin, there's a massive movement for reform and democracy from other people. So Gorbachev found himself in an uncomfortable sort of like middle ground, no man's land, where he had very little support. People were against him on one side that thought he was not communist enough, and on the other side they were against him and he was too communist, and we needed to move fully toward some sort of democratic society. So this is going to be the end of Gorbachev. Some would say, sadly. Flip over to page 6. At this point, there's a new politician on the scene in the Soviet Union, and his name is Boris Yeltsin. And he, at this point, was the leader of the parliament of Russia. So Russia, at this point, is one of many republics in the Soviet Union, and Yeltsin becomes sort of like the Speaker of the House in the Russian parliament. And he embraced the democratic anti-communist movement, and he quickly became a rival of Gorbachev. So he's one of these guys criticizing that Russia needs to go more full toward democracy and capitalism even. He was even starting to talk like that. Again, people on the other side of Gorbachev were still against him and said that we needed to go back to the way the Soviet Union was, under Brezhnev and Khrushchev. The people of Russia start to support Yeltsin. Yeltsin's a very good speechmaker, very popular politician, and he starts pulling support away politically from Mikhail Gorbachev. All of this culminated in a very famous incident called the August Coup, happened in August 1991. This is an effort for the extreme, we would call it the right wing in the Soviet Union, the communist hardliners, the people that opposed Gorbachev from within his own party that thought he was not communist enough. Gorbachev went on vacation in the summer of '91 down to an area called the Caucasus. It's a mountainous area. And these communist hardliners went down there and they kidnapped him. They basically put him under house arrest while he was in this vacation house, and they wouldn't let him leave. And it was an attempted coup back in Moscow. They were going to send tanks into the city and take back the government from Gorbachev and return the Soviet Union back to its old-fashioned communist past. Gorbachev was allowed to make a home video recording that you see here, and it was broadcast to the world to say he was not dead, he was alive, and he was angry, and he knew what was happening all around him, and but we couldn't leave this house, so he was basically a prisoner in his own home. Back in Moscow, These communist hardliners sent tanks into the city and were going to go to the Parliament building in downtown Moscow, which you see here. It was actually called the White House. That's the name of the Parliament building. And they were going to fire on it. So they were going to attack the government of Russia. These communists were essentially attacking their own government and going to take it over and go back to the past. And Boris Yeltsin came out as the leader of the Russian parliament. He came out of his office and he stood in front of this parliament building in a very dramatic fashion. And he cried out for democracy. He said that this was not going to succeed. He called for the rebirth of Russia. He stood on top of an abandoned tank and he gave this impromptu speech. And people started to come down to the city center and rally around him. And basically, in the face of such massive popular resistance, the army switched sides. So the army that was being told to fire on the Parliament building by these communist old-time leaders, the army switched allegiances and joined Yeltsin and the protesters and the democratic movement. Again, this happened so often. It happened in East Germany at the end of the Cold War, in Romania as well. The army switched from loyalty to the government to loyalty to the protest movement. And Boris Yeltsin emerged from this moment here as a very important future leader of Russia. He becomes the hero. He saved Gorbachev's life by defeating, with his speech-making ability and his popular support, the August coup. Again, there it is. Gorbachev was actually rescued and brought back to Moscow, but he was weakened politically by this event, obviously being captured, and Gorbachev is never going to be as important as he was right at that time. So the Communist Party is going to be out very, very quickly here. Russia itself, led by Yeltsin, withdrew from the Soviet Union, followed by all of the other members of the Soviet Union. So by the time we ended up at Christmas Day 1991, when all the members of the Soviet Union withdraw, there is no more Soviet Union, and Gorbachev, being the president of the Soviet Union, was simply out of a job. When there's no union left, there's no room for a president, and Gorbachev is out. Very dramatic stuff. People thought that maybe communism would end in Eastern Europe, but the fact that this was now over in the place where it started was just remarkable. No one suspected that. People thought communism would survive for decades more in the Soviet Union. This was not on anyone's horizon, even in the mid-1980s. This was a shock to the world. It was a shock to President Bush, who was our president, the first President Bush at the time. Just massive and rapid change. Flip over to the next page. German unification and the end of the Cold War. So this is the big issue after the fall of the Berlin Wall, beginning in 1990, is do we allow Germany to come back together? It was known as the German question. Are we going to let East Germany and West Germany reunite? And the concern was very obvious. Germany was historically, and would be again if reunited, the strongest economic country in Europe. Germany was also the source of the two world wars, most people argued, and so there was concerns about German military power if they were reunited. So this was not a foregone conclusion that Germany would come back together. The person that made it possible, really, was Helmut Kohl, who we learned about in the last section, being the Chancellor of West Germany. He gets the credit for being the architect of the German reunification. So that's why we call him a 20th century Bismarck. Bismarck brought Germany together the first time in 1870, and Helmut Kohl brings them back again as a nation in 1990. The East German leaders at the time actually were talking about this thing called the Third Way. They said, we're not going to be Stalinist communists, and we're not going to be capitalists. We're going to have socialism with a human face. They basically said we're going to have better socialism that's more humane and free, and they wanted to go that way. The average citizens, though, of both East and West Germany supported German reunification. This is, it was almost a religious thing. We need to bring back the nation. People felt very passionately, very spiritually about this, emotionally. To have a divided nation just simply wasn't the way that they wanted to go. In the meantime, 9 million East Germans had come across the border into West Germany just to look and see what West Germany was all about. They saw the shops were full of good food and good clothing, and then they would go back home to the east, but they saw a taste of freedom and capitalism, and they decided that it's best if we were actually part of West Germany. So this is what happens. The West Germans make an offer to East Germans and say, we will trade, you can take your East German money, which is not very valuable, and we'll give you a 1-for-1 exchange rate with a West German mark. The German money was called the mark. So the West German political leaders really almost, this deal couldn't be passed up. The East Germans were very excited to be offered this kind of generous economic settlement. A political party formed very quickly in East Germany called the Alliance for Germany, and this was the party that was set, that was pro-reunification. This is not the Communist Party. The Communist Party was really not in favor of reunification. This party won more than 50% of the votes in East Germany's parliamentary election, and so it was very clear that the will of the people of East Germany was to be reunited. So this happened in October of 1990. East and West Germany was reunited formally under West Germany's government and laws. And so really East Germany was absorbed by West Germany, and they became part of the new Germany itself. And here's a very famous picture of the German Reichstag, the parliament building, which is now once again the capital of the new Germany, and the new German flag is being raised. It was a popular, moment, lots of fireworks. It was almost like the celebrations at the end of the Berlin Wall again, same kind of thing. Very quickly thereafter, the nations of the world, really, all of Western Europe, the US, even the Soviet Union, came together in Paris in November of 1990 to sign the Paris Accords, which are essentially is the end of the Cold War. It reduces nuke weapons status. It settled all border issues. The borders that had been cast in 1989 and 90 as these nations withdrew from communism, those were all agreed upon. We brought our nuclear weapons offline. We basically, the Soviets were there too. Gorbachev was there and agreed to this type of thing. So fundamentally, the two military alliances were brought offline. So NATO and the Warsaw Pact, they weren't disintegrated, but they took down their readiness to fight war at any moment. So the Paris Accord is really the end of the Cold War in terms of a treaty. Pretty amazing situation there too. Germany also promised at this point that they would be peaceful. This is how they convinced the Soviet Union to allow this to happen. Gorbachev was still around, and they had concerns about allowing Germany to be reunited, especially because Germany had been, again, part of World War I and II against Russia. So Helmut Kohl basically promised that Germany would be a peaceful nation. They pledged never to develop nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. Another thing that the Germans did to make themselves appealing to the Soviets is they made them loans. They loaned the Soviet Union incredible sums of money, and the Soviet Union was struggling financially at this point. So the Germans were making friends with people all around them by promising that their future would be peaceful and generous to the rest of Europe. What you end up with at this point is the United States being the world's only superpower. For the last 70 years, the Soviet Union and the U.S. and then particularly during the 40 years of the Cold War, were locked in this two-man race as to who's the world's leader. And now that the Soviet Union is gone, as of 1991, we're left as the world's real only power. And you get some unusual wars that have come up that in the past would have turned into massive proxy wars for the U.S. and the Russians, and instead this time it's just us. So you have the Gulf War. Gulf War I starts with the evil dictator Saddam Hussein of Iraq decided to annex the nation of Kuwait because there's lots of good oil in Kuwait, and he thought he was going to be the dictator of the entire Middle East. He wanted to be the Arab leader from Iraq. This was one of them. This guy, if you were alive in the 90s, was the most famous dictator on the planet at that time. Every American knew who this guy was. He was our bad guy at the time. And so he made this move into Kuwait to annex it, take it over. And in the past, he would have probably been supported by the Soviet Union. And this time, they weren't there to support him. So he made this move. The world rallied against him. Our president at the time, again, was George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr. And so Bush and Saddam were the two, kind of world players at this point, 1990, 91. And Bush went to the United Nations, and the United Nations issued a resolution saying Saddam Hussein had to get out of Kuwait, that was a sovereign nation, and he was not allowed to conquer it because he wanted to, and Saddam Hussein refused to withdraw from Kuwait, and so an army of 500,000 U.S. troops started Operation Desert Storm, and this was the name of the military campaign to free the nation of Kuwait from Iraqi domination. And it was very successful. This was the world's first post-Cold War war. Our American forces just routed the Iraqi army. It was just weeks until we had victory. It was a very short war. It was just we had all kinds of brand new airplanes the world had never seen. So it was a TV war. I remember watching this. I was 11 years old. I was in sixth grade. The first war that we were kind of watching live on TV every night. And there was no Soviet Union to get in the way and turn this into something like a Vietnam or a Korea. So it was a very quick war, very successful. It showed how powerful the U.S. was. And George H.W. Bush used the term New World Order to describe the life of the world after the Cold War, the fact that there is just one superpower left and that there may not be these proxy wars in the future. We'll stop here for this time, and when we come back next time, we'll talk about the issues of Europe moving into the 1990s and early 2000s.